a letter to the Home Secretary, the Right Honourable James Cleverly, and it's signed by 50 members of Parliament. And it says, that we have to recognise the United Kingdom's historical, present and ongoing responsibility towards Palestinians in Gaza. Now, look, there are a lot of people in Gaza going through an awful time. There are many tens of millions of people all over the world going through a terrible time for all sorts of reasons. We have been incredibly generous to those who want refugee status in our country. About 500,000 people since 2016 have been granted refugee status in Britain, albeit some of them, those from Ukraine, are supposed to be on a temporary basis. But I really wonder when it comes to Gaza, and I say that because if already 46% of the established British Muslim population are, according to a recent poll, supporters of Hamas, what would that percentage be of people that come from Gaza? And I worry about integration. I worry about a group of people that come into the country with whom not only do we have nothing in common, but who support an organisation who is, from our perspective, a prescribed terrorist group. I'm joined down the line by a friend of the programme, Ivon Sampson, immigration lawyer. Ivon, it's very interesting, isn't it, that Egypt, the next-door neighbours, literally the next-door neighbours to Gaza, have refused to take any refugees. They're quite happy for aid to cross into Gaza, but they don't want any refugees from Gaza. And yet 50 of our MPs think it's a good idea. Do you see my point about the preponderance of people from Gaza that do support Hamas?
Indeed. I mean, there's an argument for that, but there's two sides to the argument. What the open letter says is that the situation in Gaza is similar to the situation in Ukraine, and it is in some ways, but it's also different in many ways. The first point to note is that we, at the British government, work closely with the Ukrainian government to set this scheme up. We haven't got a government in Gaza, in Palestine, which we can make this scheme work. And also, there was a guarantee by the Ukrainian government that they would, we could return the 174,000 Ukrainians granted temporary visas, and there's going to be no such guarantees because there's no one that can we deal with in Palestine. So it could happen that many of the people who, if such a scheme existed, could actually claim asylum when they get here. So if they did that, then we'd have to consider those claims. And as you know, there's a massive backlog. It could take several years before those claims are discussed. There's also security risk. I think that's absolutely right. There's no way of identifying those people that sympathise with Hamas and those that don't. It'll be almost an impossible task to separate those two types of people from Palestine.
Well, given that 20 years ago there was an election that took place in Gaza and that Hamas won it comfortably, and that it would appear support for the organisation has grown up to and including and after the 7th of October, the likelihood is the preponderance of those that support Hamas would be very, very high. But I take your point. Once someone sets foot on British soil for whatever reason, even if they cross by a small dinghy and claim asylum, we then feel we have to go through due process, don't we?
We do. We have an obligation under the Refugee Convention to consider all asylum applications. And if they have no merit, we refuse them. Problem, the Home Office hasn't got systems in place to consider applications quickly, sift out the genuine ones from those that are not genuine, and remove those that are refused asylum. And that could mean that, 174,000 Ukrainians have come, and it could mean that we could have probably similar amount, if not more, from Palestine under the scheme. Of course, they could set a quota.
Yeah, and how would we decide who from Gaza? Let's say the British government gives in and says, right, we'll take 5,000 or whatever they do. How would we process, how would we decide who gets the right to come and who doesn't?
Well, we don't know what the criteria was in Ukraine. The government never published that. And so one would say that the criteria, I would imagine, was that the territory was being occupied, similar as in Gaza, by the Israelis. Same situation there.
Not quite the same, but yeah, go on.
But
yeah.
there are differences because the occupation by Israel is in retaliation to the events of 7th of October, whereas the occupation by Russia is totally unprovoked. So there's no reason why Russia should be in Ukraine. And then there's also the complexities of how do we process it. There are no provisions in Gaza to do that. We'd have to have cooperation with the Israeli government to operate the scheme. And I'm wondering whether the Israeli government will be open to such a scheme to allow people to leave.
I don't think so.
Potentially, Hamas, members of the Hamas could potentially leave Gaza and be heading for the UK.
Absolutely. Ivon, thank you very much for shedding some light on that. Thank you very much indeed.